Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So tonight we have with us Mala. How you doing, Mala?
Doing well. Good evening, everyone.
Excellent. And we also have a remote reporter reporting from IV Cam. We have Mike trying to fight through camera stuff.
Hello.
How's it going other than the camera fighting?
Very well, thank you.
Excellent. And hello, chat. Good to see our Necrosoft Rednello. Speaking of Rednello, actually, our first topic for tonight comes from him. Oh my gosh, Anders is back. So, we have officially a Norwegian sighting. And welcome in, everybody. As we get started, quick note of Shop Talk. What do? We run IV Cam. What we do is, you have questions, sometimes we have answers. It's basically a time for us to chat, to have some water cooler discussion at the end of a long Monday, reminding us that, my goodness, this week goes on, doesn't it? Nonetheless, we've got a few exciting topics for tonight, and the first one, as I mentioned, comes from Rednello, who sent an email and gave us a little bit of time to think about it, thankfully, because this is an interesting, it's fairly long question, really interesting question. And so recently experienced a server hack where it looks like the hacker was interested in just defacing a website and spreading some malware, but led to some questions about, well, what happens? What if they were able to view confidential data in a database? They've done all that they can to prevent SQL injection attacks. So this wasn't a SQL injection attack. But if there were a SQL injection attack, what could they see and how would we know it? And he goes on to explain that SQL auditing is enabled on that server, but the results were not very helpful because it started out as, we're going to audit everything. We're going to audit all access, all everything, every select statement. And digging through that, even after you know there's been a breach, can be very difficult. It's finding a needle in a haystack. If you don't know if there was a breach, it's like finding a needle in a needle stack. But you have to find the right needle, which looks exactly like all of the other needles, except it's the one that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have massive amounts of select queries, how do you find the select query which comes from a malicious end user or some sort of outsider attack? If you have direct connections, like people log in with their own login credentials, then you can review the types of queries that people enter. So, for example, if you have somebody who normally works off of a certain schema or within a certain database, and they just happen to have access to other databases, finding queries in these other databases suddenly might be an indicator, if you're a security person, of there's some sort of change. Now, that change can be perfectly legitimate. This person has a new job role and they now need access to that database and are querying it. It could also be an indication of somebody else using those credentials because they're behaving in a way which is different from normal. That could be accessing data at different times of the day, accessing different types of data, that sort of thing. Select star from all of the tables, or querying things like sys.tables or information schema.tables. So our Necrosoft says maybe it was an inside job. Inside users typically are the worst, which is true. The insider tends to be the most effective at getting data. They have legitimate access to and legitimate knowledge of information, and as I said, this is, at that point, it's finding a needle in a needle stack. You don't even know that somebody has done wrong. As a security person, you don't know that there's an insider who's performing a malicious activity. So if they behave in a way which is very close to normal,
I once had somebody who was an insider. At one point, he knew the password, the application password. He was a data guy, and he quit the company. He went out and he did an injection attack and kept truncating one of the key tables in the database. So his intention was not anything terribly malicious. It was just to show them that there is a hole that can allow all this to happen. And I think it took us 3 months to find out that somebody is actually truncating this table from the outside, because a lot of people knew the password inside. So we went on thinking it's somebody who knew it is doing it. And it wasn't that. It was an ex-employee.
right, and
Right.
that opens up a few other questions of, well, wait a second, how is this person able to access our databases directly, even with a password, over the internet, because they're not connected to our network anymore, unless they are. But Red Nello says it was not an insider in this case, which is fair enough. And Arnie Kristoff says, for insiders, it's not easy to find the leak because it's not necessarily a leak. And yeah, there can be a fine line between behavior which is acceptable because it's part of the job and behavior which is just a little over the edge, and behavior further on, which is getting into illegality. So Mike says, not true. Someone in data security could or can tell you if data is moved to a place for which it is not intended to be. If it's exfiltrated, maybe. So counterexample, if I pull up data on my laptop, my company laptop, to which I have legitimate access, and I take a picture of it from my phone, if that data is interesting enough, just in that small amount, there's not a tool around that can guarantee that you can't take a photo of this laptop and have it turn out. So if you're talking about, mass exfiltration, yes, there are tools that can help. You can look at network bandwidth utilization, so you can see that, there's a lot of upload to this location, which we don't normally see. And to that extent, yes, if you're looking at mass exfiltration of data, that's commonly a technique that's used for understanding what has happened. You shouldn't have access to data you shouldn't have access to. Under rules, it'd be okay. So that brings up the question of, what about the insider who does have that access and misuses the access? So in a healthcare context, there are rules around, for example, if you're a nurse, you have access to any patient in the system. However, if you are not actively assigned, if that patient is not assigned to you, you cannot look up their patient information. Otherwise, they treat that very seriously. They fire you. But if you're in a situation where you have sensitive information that you can legitimately look up as part of the role that you play at your company or your organization, then it is much more difficult to figure out if a person is exfiltrating that data, especially if it follows in from their normal job activities. But anyhow, that's kind of diving into a interesting topic. At the Social Security Administration, certain accounts, like elected officials, will get you flagged if you look at them. Yeah, and I'm sure that at banks, they'll have their very important customers. And I already mentioned the hospital example. That is a very common example. I've known enough people in that world where there are plenty of stories of people who've thought that, well, let's look up, I want to find out this famous person's medical history, and end up getting fired as a result of it. Legitimately so. So going back to Red Nello's Question. If you have specifically created logins and you can track access by login, that's one side. That's one story. But what about if you're using connection pooling and you just have one authenticated user? That's pretty common for web applications. And then this makes auditing even more difficult because everything is accessed by that web application user account. And now you're having to create like a second layer of auditing of who performed the action which caused the user account to do this. But if your attacker gets access to the credentials for that web user, and they're not necessarily going through your application, they're connecting to the database directly using the credentials of that connection pooled account, then you open up another chance for a fun opportunity for data problems. So you can't put the auditing in the application itself. You're back to, we have to audit in the database somehow, but again, trying to separate the legitimate queries from the illegitimate queries. Developers should never have access to live customer data. Yes, but Mike, there's more than developers who work at companies. And it's not developers who are necessarily the insiders. Mm-hmm. So you have a point, yeah, that don't give developers that prod data, but there are plenty of people who have access legitimately to that prod data, and they can be bad just as bad. They can be just as bad as developers. So, I mean, limiting developers solves one part of one problem. But there comes a point where you can't simply say nobody gets access to this data, because then the data is no longer useful. Consultants can get sued and jailed, sure, and even employees can be sued and imprisoned for certain types of breach. So, yeah, there are legal actions that can be taken after the fact, assuming that you know they did it. Mm-hmm. There's also the possibility that you just don't know, and that's getting to the question that Rednello's got, which is, how do we figure out, or assuming that somebody, some malicious actor, does gain the credentials for this application account, how do we say limit the capabilities of that person to perform malicious activities? And this led to some research. So he's still looking at SQL auditing, but also looking at other ways of trying to tamp down on the capabilities of that account, which I think is a good route to take. When you start looking at service accounts, we tend to make them fairly overpowered because that makes life easier. But it leads to the possibility of an issue like this where, okay, if your application account is DB owner or sysadmin, then the moment somebody is able to obtain those credentials, whether they be stored in a web.config or if they're stored in some other app config file, or if they're Active Directory credentials and you've performed an attack that allows you to take on the role. Once somebody has that credential and connects to a system, the next question, if you're a sysadmin, basically it's game over. But what can we do, say, short of assuming that you're sysadmin or DB owner? Let's say you're doing it pretty well, that maybe you've granted DB read or DB writer and executing stored procedures to that account. They're not sysadmin, they're not DB owner. And in that case, there are some possibilities. And Rednello is doing some research, found things like if I deny select on certain system tables, sys objects, tables, views, packages, the sys schema, the information schema. The question was, would denying select be a good practice, or would it even work? That's the first question. The second one is, if it is a good idea and would prevent a bad actor from viewing table structures, would denying these break the application? Assuming that they're not directly called someplace. So both of those are pretty good questions. And I do want to open it up to chat for their thoughts as well, but I would say that it's definitely worth a try. And you could perform direct deny. So Anders asks, can you even run a deny on those? Yes, you can. And here's the example of, well, that didn't work very well. I'm going to, can I even delete my, no, I can't. I was trying to delete the chat message because sys.sysObjects now is getting translated to a URL. But yeah, Anders, you can deny on sysObjects, sys.tables to a particular user. And the chat is a blockchain, which means that I need 50% of the compute to control what chat says. Seems legitimate. You can also do something a little easier and say, well, what if I deny view definition? Also, so if you deny select on on the sys and information schemas, and you deny view definition, basically you're still going to allow the application user to execute queries, but if you ever try to execute as that user and you try to get access to sys data, so any sort of system tables, any sort of DMVs, those would fail. You try to execute, say, get an execution plan. That, I believe, would also fail because of denying view definition. We scared Mala away. We did scare Mala away for just a little bit, but Mala will be back.
I'm not scared. I'm coming right back. I just went to get something.
All right, so Solomon says, within SQL Server, only the actions necessary by the app should be allowed, and those should be encapsulated within stored procedures and their security granted by module signing.info. Funny you say that, Solomon. That was actually that was option number 4 that I had on this list. So I'm going to definitely approve of that statement. If you use stored procedures, that is a way of limiting direct table access. Your account can execute those stored procedures. You explicitly grant execute on those stored procedures, and using module signing, which Solomon thankfully has put a whole website together on, modulesigning.info. If you use that, then what that will allow is the account itself, that web user account, can only execute these procedures. It doesn't even have access to the tables or views underneath that are referenced within the procedures. But by virtue of having an account that signed a certificate, like a separate login that signs a certificate, which does have access to these, and where you have a password that people don't know about and regularly gets changed, then you can use module signing to allow the executing user, so your web user, to execute this procedure and use the context of your really powerful login to query the tables underneath to get the data back and return that to the end user. And that's going to be a much stronger solution than most other things that we're going to be able to bring up. But definitely recommend that, stored procedures plus module signing. Arnicrosoft says, I have stored procedures when in secure mode. And Solomon will be presenting on module signing at the Past Data Community Summit this year. So that's a reason to sign up. This year, that is free. There is some mic feedback. I think that's coming from Mala, maybe?
Mike, I can mute myself. 1 second.
So let's see if that fixes the feedback. If not, then we'll know that Mike was really the secret feedbacker. So that is definitely a good option. Another thing that I would recommend is, since we talked about web configs, encrypting your connection strings. So you can, I have a presentation on the OWASP top 10 for developers, and have a whole little bit on encrypting the connection strings node within a web.config. So you can use ASP.NET RegIIS to use the RSA key on the server to symmetrically encrypt your connection strings node of web.config. This isn't going to prevent a dedicated bad guy from getting access to your key if they have access to the machine itself. But if someone accidentally checks in a web config that includes a password into GitHub, for example, this is a good way of preventing that from being an issue, because you're encrypting it with the server key. That's a good way of limiting the amount of damage that can be easily done by someone who's not very knowledgeable about it. Again, won't be a perfect solution, but a combination of encrypting the the connection strings within your config files, so that somebody who might get access to the IIS folder wouldn't necessarily be able to see plain text usernames and passwords, and then using stored procedures with module signing in combination is a really good way of limiting the likelihood of a malicious attacker getting in. Also, there may be other mechanisms that you could use further on, like denying view definition, denying select on sys and information schema for that user, assuming, again, the user is not DB owner or sysadmin, because then they could just regrant themselves. But if you're dealing with a fairly regular user account, then that can be a way of reducing the risk. Not as good as the other options mentioned, but it is a quick way. And it's also one that you can fairly easily test. So Solomon says, I stepped away. I'm not sure if you said so. Mentioned using integrated security or domain accounts. Connection string won't have user ID or password. Yeah, if you're using integrated authentication, if you're using that Active Directory authentication, then you would simply connect as the user. But there's still a lot of SQL authentication in the world. All right. Mike, so, okay, Rednello says, I'll look into module signing, never heard of it before. Yes, that is definitely worth investigating. We've had Solomon discuss it. I think we may even have a recording of a presentation he's done. And he's also doing it again in November. The modulesigning.info website is pretty well complete. And a while ago, Brian Carrick did module signing for the user group as well. But I forget if that was before or after we started recording these things. Anders says, just don't store important data. I mean, that's probably a good idea. Also, you can save a lot of money by just not having a database. So when people say save, you say, cool, we saved it, and then just have it go to dev null. Much more secure that way. So Mike asks, this whole talk is about unplanned illicit access to data. What about planned exfiltration? Yeah, that's getting back to what I was mentioning, where, look, at the end of it, unless your data is in a SCIF somewhere and you're not Sandy Berger, there's going to be a way to exfiltrate data. The question is how much of it and how much effort the person is willing to put into it. There are really good techniques for reducing the risk or for making it more difficult to get by. But if you have someone who is intelligent enough, connected enough, powerful enough, and willing enough to do it, you will have data exfiltration. I think we have to start from the premise that there's no way to get away from that. At the extreme, I mentioned the Sandy Berger example where he walked out with papers shoved into his undergarments. I'll phrase it as undergarments, and ended up actually getting away with it. They caught him. They knew that he did it. It became a big news story, and the end result was nothing. I think he got a reprimand, and that was about it. So, yeah, look, if it's also like if a state actor is going to attack you, there's not much you can do about it. If major government X wants that information, they will get that information. And the question becomes, how do we not necessarily prevent major government X from getting this information, but how do we make it so that it is as difficult as possible for as many people as possible in order to deter most of the shaft, the low-grade attackers who are just out looking to get some information. Ever watch Burn Notice? Burn Notice was a great show. I enjoyed it a lot. KGB in the early Cold War couldn't transmit out of a Faraday caged room, so they recorded and exfiltrated after leaving. They've got techniques. And frankly, they had Robert Hansen, who was in charge of finding KGB moles. So again, yeah, if you happen to have turned the guy whose literal job is to find you, then you're probably going to get away with something. But in most cases, we're not talking about that level of attacker. And in most cases, we're talking about the type of person who ran a scan. They found a bunch of, say, open SQL Server instances via Shodan. They ran a scan. They tried SA and generic passwords, and they found some servers. Or they were just arbitrarily trying to hit different websites, based off of Google searches, and happened upon your website and just happened upon some sort of old JavaScript library that has a vulnerability. That kind of person. So not even necessarily a hardening or a very hard to stop targeted attacker, just the type of person who go on to get some information from wherever. Or in Red Nose case, they're just trying to deface a website. They're trying to trash whatever and set up a malware distribution point. So I do have fun stories about what you're saying, Mike. Actually, my favorite one was Alger Hiss was second in charge of the State Department after World War II. Harry Dexter White was second in charge of the Treasury after World War II. Both of them were heavily involved in the development of the World Bank for White, and for Hiss, it was a major part within the UN, and both of them were active Soviet spies. Those were interesting times, the 40s. But that doesn't get much to our point of what we're talking about with stored procedure encryption, stored procedure execution, connection string encryption, and module signing. Those, I think, are going to be the easiest long-term solution to limiting that level of access necessary. And I saw, Rednello, that you had encrypted connection strings, and I think that's a good start. If you're using SQL authentication, if you need to use it for some reason, then encrypting those connection strings is a way to make life a little bit easier for you. And we have Mike in portrait mode.
Took a long time.
And don't run old TLS. Yeah, I mean that's another thing. Don't run old TLS. And I saw, Anders, your comment about Cosmos DB being safe these days. Between Power Apps and Cosmos DB, those have been a couple of security body blows for Azure. Power Apps, we'll just let all of your information be available if you don't check this box. Why is that a box to check? For Cosmos DB, for some amount of time, anybody's Cosmos DB databases could be accessed by anybody if you happen to know how to do it. I don't know. I mean, I know that both of them have been fixed. The Power Apps one, basically, they removed the checkbox and made it a mandatory default. For Cosmos DB, it was around Jupyter notebooks, that if you crafted a Jupyter notebook in a specific way within Cosmos, you could access anybody else's Cosmos database. And so they disabled that feature as their way of fixing it, and will eventually, probably, maybe, bring it back, hopefully without the security flaw. It's a whole interesting story. And Rednose says, I appreciate it, thank you. Of course, that's what we're here for. Rambling about the 40s, talking about skiffs, and going off on rants about data exfiltration. That's what we are here for at Shop Talk, and occasionally giving an answer. Speaking of giving an answer, even if we do get Kevin easily derailed, I like to think of myself more as like a bumper car. So it's not so much being derailed as just the natural flow of things. There are no rails on bumper cars. So speaking of whatever we were speaking of, I believe it was giving answers. Mala, you had an article that was posted on SQL Server Central. Although you're on mute right now.
Sorry. Yes, I did have an article, and Jeff Moran posted a comment there asking if we could discuss it on the show. So give me a second to find the link. Stupid me, I should have had the link somewhere. Give me 1 second.
I'm pasting it now.
So my article is on using script DOM to format T-SQL scripts, sort of like what the Redgate tool does. And in fact, Redgate, this is what it uses behind the scenes. But script DOM is the API, the .NET library that Microsoft created, which is sort of like a Swiss Army knife. It can do a bunch of different things. It's very sparsely documented, no surprises there. And among the one of the things that it can do is to format your scripts. If you supply it with a script that is not, has a bunch of things that are misaligned and your reserved words are not in the right case and all that kind of stuff, it will fix all that for you. It's pretty good at doing that. And this little article there is what, is a PowerShell script that gives you what it does. And it comes with certain limitations. It can strip your code of comments. I suppose that's because when they introduce a line feed and such, they don't know where to stick your comment. That's just my guess, or maybe, whatever it is. But it's going to script your code of comments, and it doesn't have a few things. It does not have tabs. It can only do spaces, and it does not have any option to remove square brackets. The last one is a bit of a peeve with me. But Jeff Morden, who's commented on the article, he didn't like any of those limitations, and he asked that we discuss it here. That's why I put it out. But it's a fairly simple, direct thing to do if you want a free tool to format your scripts. Really easy. And I specified all the different options that are there in that thing for doing that.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive article, so definitely recommend that you check it out. And I do agree, those limitations are pretty weird. Like not being able to use tabs instead of spaces is strange.
Mm. So I passed it on to Arvind and the tools team. They don't have resources, no surprises there, which is why this thing is not documented. So they said, they put it on their list of things that they can look into. But the worst thing about it is that it's so poorly documented, so it takes you a good amount of research to get it working. It took me three and a half years to even know it exists, and where I work, nobody knew it existed. But there are some things that it can do really well. Like, for example, we are working on a linting tool where we are with it, and the linting options that it has are pretty phenomenally good. I mean, to do a good job of linting T-SQL, I don't think there is anything better for that. So we are working on that, and that's really great. And Redgate tools use the same thing behind the scenes. I did ask Steve about that, and he said that's what they use. So there's no comparison there. It's the same thing.
Oh, there you go.
So the primary use of it is linting. It can also do some formatting, and it does a great job of parsing your scripts too. If anyone has a need for that, like you have a whole bunch of scripts sitting out there that haven't been touched for a long time, and you need to run it through and see if it still parses right, or if somebody put something into the repo that is actually not a working script. We found a few scripts like that. Then it does a neat job of parsing the whole thing and letting you know this is actually a runnable script. It can do that really quickly. And the nice thing is that it requires no connection to SQL Server. It's completely asynchronous. So all you have to do is to invoke the API and tell it what to do, and it'll do it for you.
Yeah, that's an interesting bit of functionality where you don't actually connect to a SQL Server. It's not actively saying, "Hey, SQL Server, is this a valid query?" It's doing it within the client tool itself.
Right.
So, question for this is this the same parser that's used within SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio?
As far as I know, yes.
I couldn't remember if it was this or if they had their own version.
As far as I know, yes. But I could ask Arvind that. I'll put a question in there.
Yep, and Mala does have a couple of good resources. One is a C# version of a formatter by Michael J. Swart. And the other one is a talk from Arvind, which I'm going to paste this in as well. But as usual with videos, go check that out after Shop Talk. Unless we're that boring.
The talk is a little bit old, but it's still it's probably the best talk on the subject that you can get. There aren't too many people talking about this.
Yeah, Arvind is one of the few people I know who I would have guaranteed would have a talk on it.
And Aaron Bertrand has written a couple of good articles too. I'll find them and post on finding code anti-patterns using the linter, which is what I said was its primary use. So I'll find that and post it in a second.
Yeah. So as far as that goes, this is script DOM. It is useful, like Mala mentioned, good for linting, good for parsing, good for checking to see if your SQL query is in fact a valid query.
That's Aaron's article. And it's a really well researched, very good article. Yeah.
So Andrew says, which begs with this is not built into SSMS or ADS. So it sounds like it's there, just kind of in the back.
What would you mean by that, Anders?
Not intentionally accessible. It's the type of... Actually, it's more interesting that there aren't a bunch of examples on how to do this within .NET.
The main reason, from what I know, is that it's a pain. It's a bit of a pain to unravel with no help whatsoever. So unless you're really put to it, it takes too much time than it's worth in some cases. So that's why most people haven't touched it. It's like I have to go down this rabbit hole and try to figure out every property and every method on my own. No thanks.
No thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, the formatter.
Yeah. No, everything. The formatter, the parser, all of that is the same thing. Is that it's a lot of work to figure it out.
Yeah, but what Andrews is saying is it's a little surprising that Management Studio or Azure Data Studio don't have built-in formatters using this.
No, they haven't put all that to use at all.
Yeah.
No.
And with formatters in particular, given how picky people tend to be about their formatting. I mean, the fact
Right.
that Mala mentioned this won't do tabs. So that's a whole percentage of your developer base who's upset because they prefer tabs for SQL queries.
Plus, it's going to strip your code of comments, so there is no way I can run it on any existing code unless I want to lose all my comments, and nobody wants that.
Right.
So, yeah.
So we're back to the Poor SQL or one of the third-party tools for performing formats. So you said, Mala, this is the first article. Does that imply that there's another article coming up?
Mine, yeah, I have a few articles. I'm just not sure like where to start, what would be the most value add in terms of writing about it, because I know a few aspects of it really well, given that I've been working on this thing for 4 months now. But, getting my head around what is going to be useful for somebody to read outside of the work environment we are in, that's taking a bit of time. So, yeah, there are definitely other articles. Steve suggested I do a stairways, or what they call an
Stairway to
introduction.
SQL?
Yeah, the problem is that there is a lot of this to fit into one article normally that he runs. So that's a challenge. Is trying to condense it and make it, just enough for somebody to read and get to use. So it's taking some time. But yeah, definitely more articles are coming.
Good. So we're looking forward to seeing more articles from Mala about script DOM and things of that nature over time, and I'm sure that we'll talk about them as they come up.
Maybe like you're writing, maybe April or somebody would find it an interesting material for a small book. We'll see. We'll see.
Possible.
Depends on. Yeah.
If it would be interesting to see what the market would look like for a script DOM book.
I don't know. I'm sure Microsoft would be absolutely delighted. I mean, Arvind is always looking for more publicity with this thing because they've not had the time or the means to push it as far as it can go. It's a really good tool, actually. It's built very well. Especially the object model and everything is phenomenally good, and you can't find anything else like that for T-SQL anywhere else. But because they don't have documentation and they don't have many people who know what it is, it's a bit, but they're really excited about anybody's article or anything.
Excellent. So our third topic for tonight, and we're gonna try to get through it. We were talking before stream, and Mala was saying this may take a while to talk through. So it may be something that we end up talking about today, and we get back to it in a couple of weeks. We'll see. This might be our first two-parter theme on Shop Talk. But exception handling. Oh, actually, Solomon says, I'm sure that many more people are interested in this topic, as well as things like SQL CLR, than Microsoft seems to comprehend. I think
So
you're
he
right.
means what I said? He means error handling or script DOM?
Script DOM.
Oh, okay. That's encouraging to me.
Yeah, I think there's a whole class of developer who wants something like this, expected that there was something like it, and then went looking for it, found that, oh, this is very painful to get into, and either just touched the very top level surface for the one small problem, or gave up and said, no, it's just too hard. Would it be able to format ORM code captured in SQL via a trace or something along those lines?
As long as it is a T-SQL code, it can do anything with it. It needs to be T-SQL, that's all. It cannot understand or do anything with something else there. So, yeah.
Fair enough.
You can do that.
All right, so our last theme of the night, exception handling, and specifically exception handling in T-SQL with try-catch blocks. So Mala, this is also your topic. How about you give us a brief introduction on what is interesting about this topic?
So what I found interesting, by the way, this came about because I was on LinkedIn and I saw Brent Ozar share the post that he wrote on error handling and T-SQL. Kevin, I think I posted the link for that in our chat. Let me find and repost it. Anyway, the comment that Adam Mechanic made on that post, which Adam claimed that the vast majority of T-SQL does not need any error handling, which to me was like, what? I don't know. I mean, he's a very respected person, somebody who really knows what he's talking about. So I don't know if I agree with that or not. I'm very much on the fence about whether, because every single place I worked at, you do need error handling. And queries aren't just CRUD operations, they do a lot more than that. So I don't know where from what he had in mind making that statement. That's why I asked Kevin if we could discuss it. I believe that, stored procedures absolutely need error handling, and I believe the vast majority of situations require you to do more than CRUD in stored procedures, although that might be your end goal.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull up the quotation from a few days ago. Here we are. Okay, let me pull this over so I can look at you chat as I read this. So most respondents are doing things the right way. Most queries are standalone and do not need any form of individual exception handling. Even many batches containing multiple DML operations at best should be handled with a transaction, transact abort, and letting the app catch any exception that flows up. I might even go so far as to argue that in the vast majority of cases, handling an exception in T-SQL can be considered an anti-pattern, especially if the exception is not rethrown so the user on the other end can get some clue that something went wrong. So that's the thing that is going to set this discussion in motion. And it's interesting in that at the top line, if you were to ask me overall, do I agree or disagree with this sentiment? Except for the last sentence, I would say, yeah, I think I probably agree with them. With the last sentence, I say, nah, I don't think I fully agree. Now I'm somewhere between mild and moderately in disagreement. So I wouldn't say, no, you're dead wrong. This is absolutely the wrong answer. But I think it's worth some discussion. Yeah, I'm going to use that as a portmanteau of discussion and discussing. So, do standalone queries need any sort of individual exception handling? Short answer, need, maybe not. Long answer, need, maybe not, but I think it can still be quite useful. I mean, Anders mentions, hey, most CRUD stuff should not need it. Probably, but that assumes a couple of things. One is that you'll have some capable entity from the caller who is aware of the possible issues that can happen and will take action on them. So, for example, if you have something like a deadlock which occurs, then in some cases, the correct answer could simply be, just retry the thing. It's essentially the retry logic in connecting to cloud databases. If at first you don't succeed, try 2 more times before giving up. Because maybe that second time you get through, no problem, and great, your action has been taken, everything is good. Your application could handle that. The application could implement this sort of logic, yes, but that assumes that you have an application that's executing this. If it's something like a script which is running every once in a while, maybe that answer isn't quite the same. Perhaps the answer could still be the same, but if I have transactional error handling built in, then I'm going to have an easier time of automating out any negative experiences that I might anticipate. The reason that I agree with Adam on the top line portion, not the part about handling exceptions in T-SQL might be considered an anti-pattern. we'll talk about that in a little bit. But at the top line, try catch in T-SQL is not great. There are too many exceptions that try catch simply will not catch. Any severe exceptions, try catch just lets go right through. There is a whole class of exceptions that are not considered severe that try catch also will just, they won't actually catch it. You don't have nearly the capability that's built into other languages like Java, like C#, where you can specify, okay, well, try to catch this particular type of exception and then perform this action. And if that fails, if it's not that exception, try this one and maybe have a default exception handler at the end. You don't have that capability with T-SQL. It's really begin catch, and in your catch block, you're going to try to figure out what the error number is or what the error code is and process it. That, I think, lends credence to his point. The fact that error handling or try-catch style error handling in T-SQL was introduced, what, 13 years ago? I think it was SQL Server 2008. It might have been 2005. And it hasn't really been improved. Sorry, when was it?
2008.
Okay. So, introduced in 2008, hasn't really been improved. Solomon mentions there's no finally block in a try-catch in T-SQL. That's been an issue. And it was 2005, Solomon saying. I don't know. One of those two versions. Basically, I don't think that changes the story any. It's somewhere between 13 and 16 years old. No finally, no much of anything else that's been done with it. There's still the same limitations that have been there the whole time. And you're not going to be able to get, for example, from the catch block back up and retry anything. So, yeah, either of us could be wrong. It could be 2005 or 2008. I'm sure if I Googled it, I'd find the answer. But the point of the story is, it's been around a long time and frankly hasn't changed much. Not that I can remember. So, checking out chat here.
Throw was introduced in 2012, right, Kevin?
Which one? Throw?
Throw?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Throw was 2012. So Mike looked up 2005. Okay, thank you. Okay, checking chat here. Andrew says, what the statement lacks is one thing, it depends. I mean, every statement, yes, you could fall back on it depends. What might be said is an unhandled exception handler can be used to handle most production code where known occurring exceptions are handled. But a great unhandled exception handler is necessary, and we should never keep the system running without any notice given. Oh, I do agree. So on that point, I fully agree with Adam. If you're going to have a try-catch block, you need to do something with the catch block. It's not just Pokemon gotta catch them all. It's you want to record that there's an exception. You want to alert the user that there's been an issue. You want to, if you can, resolve the issue yourself. I've used try-catch, for example, where I know that every once in a while there's an issue where, for example, I might get an error. Let's say I've got multiple things that are trying to write the same entry, and I may get a unique exception. So, oh, well, I got a unique exception when trying to insert this row because in the time between when I began my transaction and when I tried to insert, somebody else snuck in a row. Okay, I can have a try-catch block that says if I received the issue, if I caught this exception, then change it to an update. I'm not going to tell you this is the best way to do it. Yeah, it's obviously the best way to the best way to do it is probably. Oh, I'm going to make somebody angry. The best way to do it is to lock the table in serializable mode, query it to determine whether or not somebody has entered a record, And while maintaining that lock on the entire table, insert your new record. Then, and only then, would you want to disengage your serializable lock on the entire table. That way, nobody can insert a row at the same time. But assuming that these failed insertions happen every once in a while, you're talking once in a blue moon, then you might handle it as a try catch, because you don't necessarily want to take the cost of a lookup every single time if 1 in 10,000 or 10 million entries is a duplicate. And at that point, you may just take the cost of catching the exception once in 10 million tries and decide eating that is worth it versus 10 million lookups, each of which is 1 to 2 IO and some amount of CPU, to check to see if a row already exists. So Solomon says, Microsoft, while great in some areas, suck in others. They seem to ignore community more often than not. Depends on the team, but yeah. For example, removing debugger from SSMS. On the feedback site, it had almost 2,000 comments, all angrily yelling at them to put it back in. And speaking of the feedback site, they just killed it without warning, as of a specific date. All that work, like thousands of hours of free QA and testing provided to Microsoft by us, that hundreds of us or more, it's just gone, and for the second time in 5 years. Yep, I think that they follow a philosophy of a product team that I've worked not directly with, but worked around at some point in my past, which was every couple of years just create a new board for the team. That way you can dump the old backlog and you no longer have a huge backlog. Seems like it's what they do. Why does it seem all bad software has been caused by programmers fixing their code? There's a long discussion that we could have about that and how calling software engineers engineers is a joke. Also, there's no finally in SQL try catch, yeah, which we talked about for a little while. Corollary, why don't we have enough duct tape to prevent all the bad programmers from coding bad programs? In fairness, that is a lot of duct tape. HR frowns upon my usage of duct tape on programmers, Anders says. The fact that they have a policy for that tells you something. And all right. And Anders drops the fun bomb. I'm not even sure why at this point. There's no timing on here, so it's totally out of context, but it's fair. It's fair. Raymond says use Gorilla Glue tape instead. That is definitely a more useful plan. Gorilla Glue tape is definitely going to stick longer than duct tape. Duct tape, surprisingly, does not stick very well to a lot of materials, including cardboard boxes. You get nothing else out of tonight's edition of Shop Talk. Don't use duct tape when using cardboard boxes for moving. If you're packing a box, use packing tape. Duct tape was just going to come right off, so don't do that, folks. Oh, locking the table. Yeah, and specifically setting your transaction isolation level to serializable first. So that's the short version of this. That, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to say don't always use try catch. I also don't think that it's a bad thing to use. I mean, as an example, if you use try catch as part of a pattern where I have gotten an exception, I can write it to some sort of event log, and then I can rethrow that exception so that the higher level system can handle it. This is particularly useful if your data people and your application people are different people and using different tools and using different processes. And if most of the data problems are things that your data people can solve directly without your application people getting involved. And I don't think that there are, I don't believe that most systems are so simple that they're all incredibly easy CRUD operations. And especially once we start talking about ORMs. At that point, nothing becomes incredibly easy.
That's where Adam's comment caught me, Kevin. Is that why does he think that they're all just CRUD operations or just basic simple stuff that needs no error handling? Or maybe it's based on what he's seen out there. I don't know.
Yeah, and my question is, where do you find those systems? That's, I don't know. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, but it's rare that I have a system which is, oh, I just have one insert, one update, one delete, a couple of read procedures, and that's it. They're all really simple queries. I barely even join tables. I don't see that happening, because as soon as you start having any sort of analytics operations, you just add 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. So I guess if you're limiting yourself to applications that nobody ever uses or cares about, but I don't intend that to be sarcastic. I know I did roll my eyes and it did kind of come off as sarcastic. I'm sure that there are applications which are very easy in terms of being straightforward CRUD operations, and for those applications, then I can believe it. But I don't know how much of that is reality. And Solomon, where I think I'm going to end on this, there are many imperfect things that are still much better than not having those things. So yes, I would still use try-catch on most things. I think that's a fair way to end it. Try-catch in SQL Server, definitely not perfect. Definitely flawed, has strong limitations, but I think it's still better than not having it at all. It opens up enough use cases that are going to be interesting, that are going to provide value to developers, to database developers, and where you don't necessarily need 3 other layers of things. You don't need your syslogger like your Splunk or some other tool. You don't need your application servers. You don't need anything else in between, where I can take this information within SQL Server, save it in SQL Server, review it within SQL Server later on if I need to, or even possibly in my catch block, if I understand what the issue is, just correct it there. So end of the day, mild disagreement with the overall tenor of Adam's comment. Agreement about much of it, not so much about it being an anti-pattern. But with this, we're at time. So we're going to wrap up Shop Talk tonight. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Remember that the next user group meeting will be the 2nd week of September. I believe that Tracy just got that posted today. Bob Pusateri is going to talk to us. So come check that out. And that's at meetup.com/trypass. In the meantime, I'm going to say, everybody, have yourself a wonderful evening.
Night.
Thank you. Bye.